Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. The Show Me Institute is a research and educational organization dedicated to improving the quality of life in Missouri by advancing sensible, well-researched solutions to state and local policy issues. Institute scholars study public policy problems and develop proposals to increase economic opportunity. Those solutions are presented in written studies, briefing papers, and educational materials which help policymakers, the media, and the general public gain a better understanding of those issues. One of those analysts is Audrey Spalding. Today she will be discussing the merits and drawbacks of state-sponsored tax credits. This program is being taped on September 27, 2011. The Missouri legislature is still technically in session. Therefore, some of the items discussed here may have changed by the time you're viewing this program. Audrey Spalding, welcome to Conversation.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we had you here earlier in the year, and we had a very interesting discussion at that time. So we thought to call you back because they're still talking about China Hub.
Right.
Erythropolis in the special session of the legislature, and there's a number of other things that we can talk about here. Briefly describe what Erythropolis or China Hub is and where it stands in the legislature and what all this means to taxpayers in the state of Missouri.
Okay, sure. The concept of the China Hub is the idea to transform the Lambert Airport into an international trade hub. That's what I mean when I talk about China Hub. Erythropolis is a bundle of tax credits, subsidies that were proposed in the Missouri legislature to help build warehouse space around the Lambert Airport. The Erythropolis subsidies would come to about $360 million. $300 million of that would go to subsidizing warehouse construction. The most recent news is that the $300 million was stripped out of the legislation in one of the more recent versions, which we think is good news for taxpayers because, as we had discussed before, a lot of the proponents' claims didn't really hold up to fact. So I think that's good news for Missouri taxpayers. However, at this time, nothing's for certain. There is still a chance that the $300 million could be reinserted or that the money could be awarded to warehouses in some other way that may have even less oversight. So we're kind of all waiting to see what's going to happen.
Well, much of the problem, or at least the holdup as I read it, is in the Missouri Senate. Mm-hmm. I'm not even sure that the House has even had a crack at this. I might be wrong about that, but it has mostly been held up in the Senate. Do you know, does the members of the House favor spending this money, or I shouldn't say spending, creating tax credits up to $360 million for warehouse space?
Well, there are certainly proponents of it in the House. Some of the strongest proponents of it have been in the House. I know a while ago a letter was sent from House member Stephen Tilley urging the state governor to...
Speaker of the House.
Yes, Speaker of the House, Steve Tilley, urging the governor to call a special session specifically to discuss the award of these tax credits. Mm-hmm. So yes, some members of the House do support this, but some members of the House do not.
And Leader Tim Jones, you have any idea what his position is?
You know, publicly he said he supported it, but as you've seen in the news, there was a recent scandal where Mamtech, a company that was slated to receive tax credits, effectively failed and left the city of Moberly, Missouri, possibly on the hook.
Right. We're going to get into that.
Sure,
in a while.
but Tim Jones saw that news and then said, you know what, I'm seeing this, and it makes me concerned about rushing to create more in tax credits. I think that in light of that, we need to slow down and take a longer look at this. Let's
back up 1 second. Warehouse space, that's what this is all about, is the creation, it has nothing to do with the cargo or the planes coming from China and going back to China, does it? This all has to do with building warehouse space where supposedly the stuff that comes off of the airplanes goes into these warehouses?
The majority of it deals with warehouse space, $300 million.
Right.
$60 million would subsidize sending cargo from St. Louis to international destinations. So a small amount of it.
Well, we'll talk about
do
that in a second. As I recall, the last time you were here, you mentioned something about there's already space there.
Yeah.
That warehouses, unused warehouses, currently exist.
Right.
So what is the argument for building fresh space? There must be an argument, and
Right.
there must be some logical argument, because
Right.
the legislators are not, they're not crazy. You
Right.
know, when somebody comes to say, hey, there's already space, they must have been handed some reason, weren't they? Something that says, well, that space isn't good enough, we need this other space because it's more modern, or something.
Right. I've seen the airport director talk about this, and I think there might be an argument made to update or build a warehouse or two on airport property. But if you start to talk about $300 million, that's well above and beyond what you would need to do what she's talking about.
Okay.
I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the legislation would have allowed the subsidies to be spent up to 50 miles away from the airport. So clearly it's not all just about building warehouses right around the airport if we would allow the subsidies to be spent out in Washington, Missouri, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, this could also, 50 miles would be close to the airport by Scott Air Force Base, Mid-America.
Yeah, but that's in Illinois, so I don't think that would work. But yeah, it's a pretty big radius. And so there are just a lot of questions that we have in terms of why would you allow those subsidies to be spent so far away if this is really about helping Lambert.
Right. Okay. Right. So $300 million to build fresh warehouse space to replace warehouse space that's not being used. I'm being facetious here. But then the other 60, again, is for?
To subsidize cargo sent from St. Louis to international
Explain
destinations.
exactly what this means. What does it mean to subsidize cargo?
Well, there would be a tax credit awarded per kilogram of weight sent to another country. So if you load up a plane with, say, 2,000 pounds or 2,000 kilograms of cargo and you send it to some other country, you would get a tax credit for some of that because you're sending weighted cargo to another
because Lambert charges a lot per kilogram? Is that?
Well,
are they trying to, like, pay that export fee for these shippers? Is that what this is?
I think the idea is to encourage freight forwarders, which are like the travel agents of air cargo, to send more flights to St. Louis because there is a concern that the flights when you send a flight to St. Louis, right, it's got to go back.
Right.
There's a concern that when it goes back, it might not have enough cargo. So the idea is to
deadheading, I believe, is the term there.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
And the idea is to encourage them to do that, to take on that cost and risk by subsidizing what does go back.
One of the things that I've thought about since our last conversation was how China Hub, in theory, is good, where it brings goods from China to St. Louis and then distributes it through our trucking networks throughout the Midwest. That seems laudable. On the other hand, when you start taking fruits, vegetables, and animals, putting them back on these planes and sending them over to China, suddenly it appears to me that we are now putting customers for Schnucks and Dierbergs in direct competition with customers in China in terms of, already celery used to be like 19 cents a stalk and sometimes as much as 2.5 a stalk.
Right. I think there are surely a lot of unintended consequences of this legislation if it ends up passing. And I think what you're talking about, where the fear is that we would be subsidizing some companies at the expense of others, is one of those unintended consequences. More generally, I think that when you talk about a project like this and $360 million, that's a lot of money, you would anticipate that there would be some kind of study saying kind of what you're suggesting, this is what we plan on shipping, this is the demand that we see for our goods in these countries. We haven't seen that. So I don't know.
You've looked?
Yeah, we've asked,
asked?
repeatedly. It's where's the, do you have a study? Do you have a partial
you
study?
ask?
We asked, primarily we've worked through Douglas Potts, who is the project manager of the Midwest China Hub Commission. But actually, funnily enough, when he sent me a bundle of documents back and I said, well, are you sure this is complete? I seem to be missing something. We were then referred to their attorney, Andrew Rubin at the St. Louis County office. So it's been a little bit of a struggle to get any kind of information from this.
What do you mean? He has an office at the county building or in St. Louis County?
A number of the members who are part of the Midwest China Hub Commission,
Yes.
which is promoting these tax credits and this concept,
Right.
work at the St. Louis County government, in the St. Louis County government. So they have dual roles.
I see.
So Douglas Potts also works in St. Louis County government, for example.
So the county government is part of the initiators and promoters
Oh, absolutely.
of this idea here.
Yes, yes. So anyway, we've asked for studies, and one of the studies that you'd hear all these promises, oh, we plan on sending beef to China. Turns out the beef study is not complete. It's what we received was a pile of unnumbered documents, incomplete. And two, beef is currently ineligible for export to China from the United States. So that's just another example of what I was talking about earlier, where you have claims, and then when you compare them to facts, they don't really add up.
Who started this idea? Do you know?
I don't. I don't know if it started in government or not.
In theory, it's a wonderful idea to create, business relationship with the Far East here in the Midwest. But of course, people who get into these businesses of trying to create that are, they're not doing it because they're altruists. They're expecting to make some cash out of it themselves.
Well, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No,
it's
there's
just when
nothing
you
wrong with
start
that.
adding government subsidies for it,
Exactly.
you need to start examining, well, what's the rationale and why are these required?
If it's such a great deal, then why isn't private capital
Right.
funding the whole project?
Well, and I don't know of any other industry where you can ask for $500 million or $360 million and not submit documentation and studies demonstrating how this money is going to be used and why it's necessary, except for government.
Perhaps I'm mistaken of the legislature. So let's, you had indicated a few minutes ago about something called MAMTech, which just weirdly enough happened to be on the front page of the Post-Dispatch today, the 27th of September. And I wasn't really all that, I'd heard the term before, but I'd not really followed it until I read this article, this long article about this. Why don't you just describe what you know about MAMTech and what that means to the taxpayers of the state of Missouri?
Sure. MAMTech is a company that promised to build a warehouse to build a factory to produce artificial sweetener here in the United States. The State Department of Economic Development, which administers a lot of the tax credits that we were talking about earlier in general, got with MAMTech and helped market it to various municipalities. Ultimately, Moberly, Missouri took the bait. There was a press conference announcing more than 612 jobs. Governor Jay Nixon was there. It was touting millions in investment.
When was this?
This was last year in the summer, I believe in July 2010. And it all sounded like a great idea. Fast forward.
Who are these people that were going to be doing this?
Well, the company MAMTech supposedly had an office in China and wanted to bring jobs to the United States, which was actually something that Governor Nixon was excited to talk about. He said basically, you hear about jobs going to China. When do you hear about Chinese jobs coming to the United States? So there's all of this optimism. And of course, the State Department of Economic Development pledged some amount of money and tax credits towards it. And the city of Moberly pledged about $40 million in bonds. So now, in that article that you read in the Post-Dispatch and everywhere else, we're hearing that 612 jobs haven't been created. In fact, it looks like the company has failed, and sadly, perhaps Moberly is on the hook for some of that debt that it took on to encourage the company to come to Moberly. So this is
the city of Moberly I believe it said in the article, had somehow backed or put out $39 million
Right.
in bond. Moberly's not a big town, is it?
No,
So
no,
$39
it's
million,
not.
that's a lot of money to a small
Right.
town.
I believe I took a look at the population of Moberly. I think that the amount of debt comes to about $2,700 per Moberly resident. So it's a pretty incredible amount of money if you think about it. And so people always say, for example, well, tax credits, what's the harm, right? You know, if we don't award the money, we just promise it, but you know, what's the harm? Moberly, Mamtech is an exact example of what the harm is, right? You get a city excited about this project, you pledge state tax credits, which by the way, weren't awarded, but you get everyone excited, the city takes on debt, and suddenly we've got a failure. And to add insult to injury, there was a small newspaper that...
I was going to say, did somebody see this coming,
Yeah.
this failure?
There was a small newspaper called the Moberly Mirror, and they just very innocently said, you know, which we're not sure how you came up with this job estimate. And this actually sounds very similar to what we're dealing with Aerotropolis. They said, you know, you're planning on building a facility. Why won't you use one of our vacant facilities? Two very small questions. They were referred to the higher up. Mamtech wouldn't answer that question. And then, according to the editor at the Moberly Mirror, they started being told that people were going to pull their advertisements because of their investigation of Mamtech. They decided, well, you know, seeing the writing on the wall and the fact that they wouldn't be able to continue because their advertisements were being pulled, they did an investigation of Mamtech, and it's kind of a sad swan song because they no longer exist, but their website, if you go to it, I believe it's themoberlymirror.com, just shows what they found in that last investigation of Mamtech, and it's all the questions that we hear all the time about tax credits. Why don't the job estimates match up? Where's the evidence of financial support or the ability to do this? You know, just these basic questions that proponents of these subsidies say, well, you know, why are you asking those? It seems kind of, you know, why bother asking those? This is such a good idea.
Isn't that what a journalist is supposed to do? Is
you'd think
ask
so.
questions?
Right, you'd think so. And so it's bittersweet because the newspaper is closed and the city is no better off. In fact, it's worse off. But you would at least hope that perhaps legislators would take this opportunity to learn a lesson. And I just got an email this morning, actually, from someone who directed me to another company that got a $1 million loan from the state and appears to have defaulted with similar job promises and everything else. So I think
Wait, they got $1 million loan from who?
The state, a state loan. And
how does that work? I mean, where do I go to get my $1 million?
you'd probably go to the State Department of Economic Development and promise some jobs. I think that's what you would do. I'm not intimately familiar with these details, but you can bet I'm going to take a closer look at this after our conversation. And anyway, they defaulted. The state hasn't been able to recoup the $1 million. It's been referred to the Attorney General. Who knows what's going to happen there?
This is Chris Koster?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. The man he's running for re-election.
Yes. And so the question we should all be asking and legislators should be asking when considering whether to create more in tax credits is, how many Mamtechs are there out there? You know, and how many of those failures are we willing to take on and to have for the promise of things like the Aerotropolis tax credits?
Well, how much money does the economic development arm of the state of Missouri get?
Well, the way I'll answer that is with tax credits. And by the way, tax credits, they're basically like money. They're a dollar for dollar reduction in your tax bill. And if you get $10 million in tax credits, they're usually transferable, meaning you can sell them and get the cash. So they're fungible. You can use them to finance a company. The State Department, Missouri as a whole has hit the point where it's now more than $500 million a year has been redeemed in tax credits. So we're hitting a point where we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars every year that are effectively being cashed. If I write you a check at some point in the future, you're going to cash it. We're hitting a point where it's hit upwards of $500 million in tax credits cashed. So that's a lot of money. And by the way, you'll hear some say,
Wait,
well,
how much more is out there that is still available to be cashed in?
that is a very good question. You're talking about our liability,
Yeah.
right? You know, I've
If
seen
a $500 million has already been cashed, there's
in
probably
2010 only. So
Wow.
think about it as per year.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a liability issue. I think reasonable people can disagree about just how big our liability is, but you can bet that there is a liability out there. So if we were to stop tax credits tomorrow and say we're not awarding anymore, there's still millions of dollars that's going to be redeemed in the future.
Now, under the China hubbub at the legislature, there was talk about ending certain tax credits in order to free up money for the warehouse tax credit. Which tax credits were on the chopping block to be removed?
One that people talk about a lot was the circuit breaker tax credit, which would provide assistance for low-income seniors who are renting. So it's a tax credit towards your property tax bill or the amount
This is
in
for
rent.
the homeowners, not for the renters, right?
I believe the renters could redeem it as basically looking at your rent, a portion of your rent is going towards the owner's property taxes. So I believe there's some calculation there. That was one. A number of caps were proposed as well, most notably on the historic redevelopment tax credit, which many people use to redevelop buildings, primarily in St. Louis City. That's where the bulk of that money goes. I think it's interesting seeing this argument about tax credits because it seems as if there's no question that there's a need for reform. You know, we've got the MAMTech things, we've got the state auditor with reports saying that, you know, they're more expensive than advertised and the job numbers that the DED touts have been wrong in the past. The governor called a tax credit review commission that met to discuss how to reform tax credits, and they recommended actually scaling back, if not eliminating many. So there's no question that there's a need for reform. But it seems like we're in this point where people just don't want to give up, you know, where we say, okay, we'll reform those, but in exchange for reforming those, there's another can't miss opportunity over here. Can we create more tax credits over here? And it just seems like there's this dissonance, so there's this disconnect in some ways.
Long ago, we had a guest here from Gamblers Anonymous. Perhaps we need to have these folks go talk to him.
Yeah.
What has been the experience of other states? I mean, there's always this talk about, well, we're in competition, you know, with Illinois, with Indiana, with Michigan, and Kansas, and all the states that surround Missouri. What has been their experience with tax credits?
Sure. One of the most substantive studies that has been done on tax credits was done in Michigan by an organization like the Show Me Institute. They surveyed tax credits that were promised or awarded over a 10-year period, and they compared outcomes versus promises. So promises are like the press release saying 20,000 jobs or whatever. Right. They found that in more than 90% of the cases, the outcomes did not match the promises, in that the promises were overly optimistic and perhaps the jobs were never created.
I thought you were going to tell me they got more jobs than they expected.
Unfortunately,
No?
not. Right. Michigan's my home state. You know, I wish that Michigan was getting a return on this, but they're not. Recently, just this year in Ohio, I believe the Dayton Daily News did a review of the amount of dollars in tax credits awarded, and then just looked at how many jobs were acquired as a result of that. And they found that in Ohio, it was about $66,000 per job. Now, usually when we talk about a job, we're talking about one job in a one-year period, not a job, you know, into perpetuity. So when we were talking about $66,000 per single job, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of financial sense. Given what if a job is paying less than $66,000? Is the state really picking up the entire tab? In fact,
Why not just give it to people? I mean, if you're going to do that, just give money to people and cut out all the
Yeah.
the middlemen.
I have a friend, and I said, did you know that in St. Louis City alone, there's been more than $1 billion in tax credits awarded in about 10 years? And he said, well, I think to get a better return, they should just back a Brinks truck up and, you know, give out the money, because it doesn't look like St. Louis City's gotten a whole lot either.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Dayton. That's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. You would think that if anywhere is going to do pretty well in Ohio, it's going to be near an Air Force base.
Yeah. Well,
We got about 3 minutes left here, so I guess by saying that, I'm saying if there's any areas that you want to cover that we haven't yet, let's get to it now.
sure. I think we need to have some sanity when we talk about competing for jobs in this state. If you think about it, if we see a company move from Kansas City, Missouri, say, to Leland, Kansas, on the other side, there's a big to-do about we're losing jobs. You know, we're losing. We need to sit back and think, okay, did Kansas award tax credits? In this case, yes. What was the cost per job? In this case, more than $100,000. Would it make sense for us to award that much money? Or should we be spending our time and our efforts lowering the tax burden overall in our state and encouraging companies across the state to flourish and companies to move in? I think when we see something like that, that's the scene, right? That's the squeaky wheel, as it were. But what we're not seeing is that by having a competitive tax policy and, you know, not having overly burdensome business license requirements, we may be encouraging hundreds of companies to flourish just a little bit more. And I think we need to keep that in mind before we panic every time we see a company moving.
Has Show Me Institute ever provided the state with maybe a list of things that the state is doing to encourage businesses not to come here?
I believe that we have not done that formally, but one of our next steps after talking about the harms of tax credits is to talk about ways that the state can make itself competitive. So I would say to you and your viewers, that's coming in the near future. Keep an eye out for that.
Because you hear a lot now about burdensome regulation. That's become a new buzzword, and unfortunately we're so short on time. But burdensome regulation, sometimes the regulations are there for real good reasons, but if they are burdensome, perhaps they need to be rethought and stripped out of law.
Absolutely. We recently had a intimate conference with directors of organizations that provide services to low-income individuals in the St. Louis area. And what we were talking about there were regulations that are burdensome, that do no good, and seek to harm individuals at the lower end of the income spectrum.
That's about all the time we have. This is television. We're on the clock. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And to my audience, I've been speaking with Audrey Spalding. She is with the Show Me Institute, a very interesting organization. Go to their website. You've seen that listed here on the screen. To the rest of you, we'll see you next week. Thank you.